The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late March of 1882, and by Friday, Edna Reed had packed every possession she owned into a single leather trunk, sold the furniture from her apartment above a Cincinnati dressmaker's shop, and bought a one-way train ticket heading west. Her father, Thomas Reed, had been dead for 6 weeks when the attorney's notice finally caught up with her, forwarded twice through postal offices that had trouble keeping track of a woman who moved apartments as often as the seasons changed. The letter was brief, written in the dry language of legal men who had no patience for sentiment, but the meaning of it struck her straight through the chest like a cold wind off a winter river. Thomas Reed, formerly of Harlan County, Kentucky, and most recently of Coltrane County, Texas, had died of a fever on the 14th of February and had left behind, in full legal title, 160 acres of rangeland in the territory outside the small town of Dry Creek, Texas, along with a modest ranch house, a barn, a working well, and whatever cattle remained on the property at the time of his passing. Edna had not seen her father in 4 years. They had parted on difficult terms, the kind of difficulty that accumulates slowly between a stubborn man and a daughter too much like him to back down from a disagreement. He had gone west with dreams of building something lasting, and she had stayed east with equal stubbornness, convinced she could build her own life without his land or his name or his plans for her future. She had been wrong about several things, and the letter in her hand proved it. She had not gone to him while he was alive, and now she could not, and the guilt of that sat in her stomach like river stones for the entire 3-day train journey from Cincinnati to Dallas, and the long coach ride south toward the red dust and wide sky of Coltrane County. The town of Dry Creek was smaller than she had imagined. It had a single main street running east to west with a general store, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office, a saloon that seemed to be doing the most business of any establishment on the block, a livery stable, a barber shop, a small church at the far end of the street, and a building that served as both the sheriff's office and the county courthouse on the days when the circuit judge came through. The coach stopped in front of the general store, and Edna stepped down onto the packed dirt with her leather trunk, her small traveling bag, and a set of clothes that marked her immediately as someone who had come from somewhere else. She was 26 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned up beneath a practical traveling hat, gray eyes that had a directness to them that some people found uncomfortable, and the kind of posture that came from years of working in a dressmaking shop where standing straight was simply the standard. She was not a fragile woman, not soft in her thinking or her manner, but she had never in her life set foot in a place quite like this, and the dry heat of the Texas afternoon wrapped around her like something alive. The first person to speak to her was the postmaster, an older man named Harold Finch, who recognized her father's name the moment she introduced herself, and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and curiosity. He told her the Reed property was about 4 miles south of town along the creek road, and he told her one other thing that she had not expected. "You ought to know," Harold said, leaning on the wooden counter with the ease of a man who had lived in a place long enough to consider himself its unofficial historian, "that Samuel Redmond has been running that land for going on 3 years now. Your father hired him on as foreman back in '79, and after Thomas took ill last fall, Samuel kept everything going, kept the cattle from drifting, kept the fence lines repaired, kept the whole operation from falling apart while your father was too sick to manage it. He's still out there." Edna absorbed this information with the same measured expression she gave most things, though inside she felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and wariness. A man she had never met had been living on and managing land that now legally belonged to her. She thanked Harold for the information, arranged for her trunk to be stored at the general store until she could get it transported to the property, and hired a horse from the livery stable, a sturdy brown mare named Biscuit according to the young stable hand who helped her saddle up. The road south along the creek was red dirt lined on one side by scrubby live oak trees, and on the other by open rangeland that stretched toward a horizon so wide and flat it looked painted. The sky above Texas was a thing in itself, a vast and overwhelming blue that made everything beneath it feel simultaneously small and significant. Edna rode slowly, not because she was uncertain on a horse, but because the landscape demanded attention. She could feel the heat of the afternoon on her shoulders through her traveling coat, could smell the dry grass and the faint mineral smell of the creek somewhere behind the tree line, and something about the smell of the place triggered a memory of her father so sharp and unexpected that she had to stop the horse and simply sit there for a moment, breathing. Thomas Reed had always smelled of grass and horses and the particular leather oil he used on his saddle. She remembered that from childhood, remembered climbing into his lap as a small girl, and that smell being the smell of safety. She had let time and stubbornness erode that connection until it was barely a thread, and now the thread was gone, and what she had instead was 160 acres of Texas land, and the name of a man she had never met who had kept it alive. She pressed her heels gently into Biscuit's sides and rode on. The ranch came into view around a long bend in the road, and Edna pulled the horse to a stop at the fence line and simply looked. The house was modest, built of weathered wood and stone, with a covered porch running along the front and a stone chimney at one end. The barn was larger than the house, solidly constructed, and the fence lines running out from it in all directions were in good repair, the posts straight, the wire tight. There was a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, recently turned earth with the first small green shoots of early spring plants just visible. Cattle grazed in the near pasture, red and brown against the green-gold grass, and the whole thing had the look of a place that was being actively cared for, not a property left to go to ruin in the wake of a death. A man was working at the fence line on the east side of the barn, replacing a post that had apparently come loose. He had his back to her and had not heard her approach over the sound of the hammer. She watched him for a moment before she called out. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. "I'm looking for Samuel Redmond." The man set down his hammer and turned around, and Edna found herself looking at someone who was perhaps a few years older than herself, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of face that the Texas sun had turned to a deep, weathered brown, and that hard physical work had made lean and angular. He had dark eyes beneath the brim of a well-worn hat, a jaw that had not been shaved in a day or two, and the kind of hands that told you immediately that this was a man who worked with them every single day of his life. He was not handsome in the polished way of the men she had known in Cincinnati, but there was something about his steadiness, the way he stood without fidgeting, the way his eyes met hers directly without apology, that made him difficult to look away from. "That's me," he said, and his voice was unhurried, carrying the soft cadence of a man who had grown up somewhere in the South. "My name is Edna Reed," she said. "Thomas Reed was my father." Something shifted in his expression then, a brief flash of something she could not quite name, and then he took his hat off and held it in front of him with a respect that struck her as entirely genuine. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Reed," he said. "Your father was a good man." She climbed down from the horse and tied it to the fence post nearest her, and she walked toward him, stopping at a polite distance. "I've come to settle the estate," she said. "I have the legal paperwork establishing my title to the property. I wanted to come out and see the land and speak with you about the arrangement my father had with you." He nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting this visit and had already given some thought to how it would go. "Come up to the porch," he said. "I'll get you some water. It's a warm afternoon to be riding." It was a practical offer, not particularly warm and not particularly cold, and she appreciated that he did not treat her as though she were fragile or out of place, the way some men did with women who appeared somewhere unexpected. He simply assessed the situation practically and responded to it practically, and she found that immediately comfortable. She sat on the porch steps while he went inside and came back with a tin cup of water drawn from the well, cold and clean and tasting of minerals, and she drank it while he sat on the porch railing across from her with his own cup, easy in his surroundings in the way that a man is easy when he has spent years somewhere and the land has become part of him. "How long have you been on this property?" she asked. "Since the spring of 1879, he said. "Your father advertised for a foreman in the Dallas paper. I had been working ranches over in Bixar County for about 4 years before that, and I came up looking for something with more responsibility. Your father liked that I had some experience managing men and cattle both. And when he took ill," she said carefully, "what happened?" He looked at her steadily. "He started showing signs of weakness in the fall of last year. Fever came and went. He didn't want to stop working, kept insisting he'd be fine, and I let him have that for as long as I could before it became clear that someone needed to take over the day-to-day management of the property or it would all fall apart. He asked me to keep it running. He said," and here Samuel paused briefly, as though choosing his words with care, "he said his daughter would come eventually, and he wanted there to be something worth coming to." The words landed on Edna with a weight she had not prepared for. She looked down at the tin cup in her hands for a moment, at the way the late afternoon light caught the water still inside it. "He talked about me," she said. It was not quite a question. "More toward the end," Samuel said, and there was a gentleness in the way he said it that suggested he understood the complicated territory he was navigating. "He was proud of you. He talked about how stubborn you were, like it was the best quality a person could have." She looked up at him, and for a moment the emotion that had been sitting in her chest like a stone since Cincinnati threatened to rise all the way up, but she held it down with the same discipline she held most things and gave him a small, composed smile. "He would say that," she said. They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable for a moment, and the cattle moved in the near pasture, and a hawk turned slow circles overhead, and the sun continued its long westward slide toward the flat horizon. "There are 2 hired hands," Samuel said, returning to the practical matters with what she was beginning to understand was his natural mode, steady and methodical and purposeful. "Hector and young Pete. They've been with the operation for about a year each. I've been paying them out of the ranch account your father set up at the bank in Dry Creek. I can give you a full accounting of everything that's been spent and earned in the past 6 months. "I'd appreciate that," she said. "There are 53 head of cattle," he continued, "all in fair to good condition. The well is good. The barn needs a new section of roof on the east end, but it hasn't been urgent. The house is in order. I've been sleeping in the foreman's quarters at the back of the barn to keep clear of the main house." She noticed that last detail, appreciated it. He had been scrupulous about maintaining a boundary between himself and a property that he had been managing, but that he knew was not his. "I'll want to look at the full accounts," she said, "and I'll want to walk the property line. I need to understand what I've inherited before I decide what to do with it." "Of course," he said, and he did not add anything to that, did not ask what she was considering or offer an opinion on what she ought to do with land that had not been his even when he was the one keeping it alive. She noticed that too. She stayed on the property that first evening, sleeping in the main house for the first time. Samuel had a fire going in the kitchen stove before she arrived, had found her clean linens, had left a covered plate of food on the table with the manner of a man who was simply doing what needed to be done without making any particular ceremony of it. She ate alone at her father's table, in her father's chair, looking at the few things of his still placed around the kitchen: a tin coffee mug, a worn almanac from 1881, a pair of work gloves hung on a nail near the door. She cried then, quietly, in the privacy of the kitchen with only the lamp for witness, letting herself grieve properly for perhaps the first time since the letter had arrived. Then she wiped her face, washed the plate, and went to bed in a room that smelled of cedar and her father's absence. The following morning she was up before sunrise, a habit from years in the dressmaking shop where the early light was the best for fine work. She had the coffee on when Samuel appeared at the porch steps in the gray pre-dawn, clearly surprised to find the kitchen light already lit. "Coffee's hot," she said from the doorway, and he looked at her for a second with that particular expression of a man recalibrating his expectations. And then he came up the steps and accepted the cup she held out to him. They stood on the porch together in the first blue light of the morning, drinking coffee, watching the sky lighten from the east. The land revealed itself slowly, the pastures emerging from dark, the distant tree line taking shape, the cattle becoming visible one by one as the light increased. "It's something," she said quietly. "Every morning," he agreed. She walked the property line with him that day. It was a long walk, 4 miles in roughly the shape of a rectangle, and he knew every foot of it, could tell her about every repair that had been made and why, could point to the fence posts he had replaced, and the sections of creek that watered the east pasture and the low area in the southwest corner, where the grass grew particularly rich in wet years and thin in dry ones. He knew the land the way you only know a place you have loved for years, with an intimacy that went beyond the practical, a relationship with the ground itself. She watched him as much as she watched the land, filing away impressions. He was patient. He explained things without condescension, speaking to her as someone he assumed was intelligent enough to follow what he was saying, which in her experience was not a universal quality in men dealing with women on matters of property and cattle. He stopped to show her the tracks of a coyote near the south fence and told her about a problem they'd had the previous summer with cattle wandering through a broken section near the creek. And he told it as a story with a beginning and middle and end. The way a person tells a story to someone they are beginning to consider as actually present with them, rather than simply a figure to be informed. By the afternoon of the second day, she had reviewed the accounts he had kept, written in a careful hand in a ledger that was neat enough to have satisfied any Cincinnati bookkeeper. He had recorded every expense, every sale, every head of cattle purchased or sold, every payment to Hector and Pete, and the balance was better than she had expected. He had run the operation not lavishly but sensibly, with an eye toward keeping the land solvent while the owner was unable to manage it himself. "This is thorough work," she said, looking up from the ledger at where he sat across the kitchen table from her, turned slightly in his chair, watching out the window at the barn. "Your father trusted me to do it right," he said simply. "He was right to trust you," she said. He looked back at her then, and something in the directness of her statement seemed to land differently than he had expected. He held her gaze for a moment longer than politeness strictly required, and then he looked back out the window, and she returned to the ledger. But the air in the kitchen had shifted very slightly in a way that neither of them remarked upon. Over the first week she spoke at length with Hector, a Mexican man in his 40s who had worked cattle ranches across southern Texas and who had a quiet competence that she respected immediately, and with young Pete, 19 years old and eager in the way of someone new to working life, anxious to prove himself. Both men treated her with a careful formality that she understood was partly uncertainty. They did not know whether she would keep the ranch, keep any of the arrangements that had been in place. She told them directly that she was not making any decisions until she understood the situation fully, and that they should continue their work as normal in the meantime. Both men appeared to relax visibly at this and return to their jobs. The town of Dry Creek was more complicated to navigate. She went in twice in the first week, once for supplies and once to speak with the attorney who had handled her father's estate, a man named George Hartley who had an office above the bank, and who seemed genuinely surprised that she had appeared in person rather than handling everything through correspondence. "Most Eastern inheritors," he said carefully, "choose to sell the property rather than make the journey." "I know," she said. "I chose to make the journey." He processed this and moved on, walking her through the legal paperwork with efficiency. The title transfer was straightforward. Her father's will was clear and uncontested. She was, As of that conversation, the legal owner of 160 acres of Coltrane County, Texas, all cattle and improvements included. In the saloon, which she passed on the way back to the livery stable, she overheard two men discussing the Reed property and the woman who had come to claim it, speaking loudly enough that they clearly did not expect her to be within earshot. One of them said it was a shame that a good piece of land would likely be sold off to some Eastern land company that would break it up, and the other said he'd heard the woman was not the type to stick, that she looked like a city girl and city girls never lasted in Texas. Edna kept walking and said nothing, but she filed both opinions away. It was on her 8th day on the property that she and Samuel had their first real conversation, the kind that went past the practical and touched on the personal. It happened because of a thunderstorm. A dry Texas afternoon turned without much warning into a proper spring storm, the kind that rolled in off the plains with a wall of green-black cloud and whined enough to lift a hat off your head and tumble it across 3 pastures. They had been out checking the south fence together when the storm broke, and by the time they made it back to the barn, they were both thoroughly soaked. The horses were already in their stalls, Hector having had the good sense to bring them in when the clouds started building, and Edna and Samuel stood dripping in the barn doorway watching the rain come down in silver sheets across the pasture, while lightning walked along the horizon. "I don't know why anyone in Texas thinks they can predict the weather," she said, wringing water from the end of her braid which had come entirely undone in the wind. He laughed, a genuine laugh that was the first she had heard from him, and it was a good sound, warm and unguarded, the laugh of someone who does not do it for performance. "Your father used to say the only honest thing about Texas weather was that it was dishonest," he said. "That sounds exactly like him," she said. They moved back into the barn away from the blown rain, settling on the hay bales near the horses, and the sound of the storm on the roof was so loud and enveloping that the intimacy of sitting close enough to hear each other seemed natural rather than forward. "Did you grow up in Texas?" she asked. "Tennessee," he said. "Near Nashville. My father had a small farm. I left when I was 20 and worked my way south and west. Spent a couple of years in Louisiana, then over the border into Texas." He paused. "I don't know that I was looking for anything particular. I just kept moving until I stopped." "And you stopped here," she said. "I stopped here," he agreed. "Why did you stay after my father died?" she asked. It was a direct question and she watched him take it without flinching. "Because walking away from something I'd spent 3 years building felt wrong," he said. "Because I'd given your father my word I'd keep the place up. Because," he paused, seeming to search for the right words, "I don't think land cares much about who's supposed to be looking after it. It just needs someone to show up every morning." She looked at him for a long moment, the rain roaring on the roof and the horses shifting quietly in their stalls behind them. "I want to keep it," she said. She had been thinking it for days, but saying it aloud to him felt like the thing that made it real. He looked at her steadily, without surprise exactly, but with something that might have been relief. "Good," he said, and meant it. "I don't know enough about ranching," she continued, practical even in her moments of decision. "I know fabric and stitching and account books, and I know how to work hard, but I don't know what I don't know about running cattle on Texas land, and I need time to learn it." "That's an honest assessment," he said. "Will you stay on?" she asked. "As foreman, same arrangement you had with my father, or better if the accounts allow." He considered this for a moment in the way he considered most things, not slow exactly but thorough, as though he was checking something internally before he answered. "I'll stay," he said. "Thank you," she said, and she offered him her hand, and he shook it, and the handshake lasted perhaps a second longer than it needed to, both of them feeling the particular charge of a formal gesture between people who were perhaps not quite as formal with each other as the gesture implied. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most interesting of Edna's adult life. She threw herself into learning the operation with the same focused intensity she had brought to mastering dressmaking, which meant she was up at dawn and asking questions from the moment anyone else was awake, and keeping notes in a small journal she carried in her apron pocket, and making mistakes and correcting them quickly, and without excessive self-recrimination. She learned to assess the health of cattle from Hector, who was patient and thorough, and treated her knowledge of business and accounts with a respect that made the exchange easy. She learned from Pete how to mend fence wire without tearing her hands to pieces, though she did tear them some at first, and wore the scrapes without complaint. She learned from Samuel everything else, which was most things, and he taught the way he did most things, directly and without condescension, calibrating his explanations to what she already understood and building from there. They spent a great deal of time together in those weeks, necessarily. There was a naturalness to it that surprised her. She had spent most of her adult life working beside other women, in the close quarters of the dressmaking shop, and the experience of working alongside a man from dawn to dusk had a different quality, a different set of rhythms and silences. Samuel was comfortable with silence in a way she found restful rather than awkward. He did not fill quiet moments with noise for its own sake, and she appreciated that, because she was not a person who required constant conversation either. They did talk, though. They talked the way people do when they work together every day, building up a map of each other in small installments. She learned that he had 2 sisters still in Tennessee whom he wrote letters to twice a year, that he had never been married, that he read when he could get books, which was not often enough in Dry Creek, that he had a particular distrust of rattlesnakes that he acknowledged was slightly beyond what was strictly rational, that he had served briefly with a cattle drive up to Kansas in 1877, and found the experience so miserable he had decided he preferred having a fixed address. She told him about Cincinnati, about the dressmaking shop, about the women she had worked with and the one good friend she had left behind named Clara, about the way she had taught herself bookkeeping from a manual, because the woman who owned the shop kept muddled accounts and Edna could not bear the inefficiency. She told him, carefully and in pieces, about her father and the argument that had caused their estrangement, a disagreement about a man she had very nearly married in Cincinnati, a man her father had met once and formed an instant and implacable dislike of, which had turned out, 4 years later, to be entirely correct, but had felt at the time like control masquerading as concern. He was right, she said one evening, sitting on the porch after supper with the day cooling around them and the stars coming out thick and bright in the way they only did away from city lights. About the man. He was a coward when it mattered and shallow underneath all the polish, but I had to figure that out for myself, and I resented my father for trying to save me the trouble before I'd earned the knowing of it. Sounds like something Thomas would do, Samuel said. He was leaning back in his chair, his boots up on the porch railing, looking at the sky. He wasn't a subtle man. If he had a thought about something, he said it. No, she agreed. He was not subtle at all. Neither are you, Samuel said, and he said it with a quiet warmth that made it entirely clear it was not a criticism. She looked at him sideways, a small smile at the corner of her mouth. No, she agreed again. I suppose not. There was a particular quality to the evening light on the ranch that she had begun to look forward to without having made a conscious decision to do so. The way the long flat light of late afternoon turned the grass gold and the red dirt a deeper red, and the way the shadows stretched from the fence posts, and the sounds of the cattle settling for the night and the horses in the barn. She had spent 26 years in cities, in rooms with walls close enough to touch on both sides, and this open, enormous landscape had done something to her that she had not expected. It had entered her in the way love enters a person, gradually and then all at once, until she could not imagine being anywhere else. She was aware that some of that feeling was tangled up with Samuel. This was something she acknowledged to herself with characteristic directness, but did not yet do anything with, because the situation was complicated in ways that required careful navigation. He worked for her, technically. The land was hers legally. And whatever she felt when he walked into a room or handed her something or told her something she had not known before, she was not a woman who moved without thinking, and so she thought. In May, a man named Clem Dawson came to call. He was the owner of the ranch that bordered the Reed property on the west side, a large operation with several hundred head of cattle, and a reputation for aggressive land acquisition that Harold Finch at the post office had mentioned to Edna as something she should be aware of. Dawson was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with an expensive hat, and the manner of someone accustomed to being the most significant presence in any room he entered. He came with a formal courtesy that was clearly a practiced instrument rather than a natural disposition, and he made her a cash offer for the property within 10 minutes of sitting down at the kitchen table. It was a fair offer. She could tell that much even from her limited knowledge of land values in the county, but it was fair in the way of a man who was confident he was buying something that the seller would eventually be willing to let go of. "I appreciate your interest," she said, "but I'm not selling." He looked at her the way men sometimes looked at her when she gave them answers they had not expected, with a momentary recalibration behind the eyes. "Miss Reed," he said, with a patience that suggested he was prepared to be generous in his explanation, "this is a hard country for someone who didn't grow up in it. Running cattle out here takes years to learn and connections to the right people, and Mr. Dawson," she said pleasantly, "I have a foreman with 12 years of Texas experience, 2 reliable hired hands, 53 head of cattle in excellent condition, full accounts in order, and a functional operation. I know what I have, I know what it's worth, and I am not selling. I hope you'll enjoy the ride back to your property." Samuel had been in the barn during this conversation. She told him about it that evening over supper and watched him very nearly smile, a slow, controlled thing that started at the corners of his eyes before it reached his mouth. "How did he take it?" he asked. "With considerably less grace than he arrived with," she said. "He'll come back," Samuel said. "I know," she said, "and I'll say the same thing again." He did come back twice more over the following months, and she did say the same thing. By the third visit, he had dropped the courtesy entirely, and simply made a harder offer with a harder edge to it, implying rather than stating directly that it would be to her advantage to sell before the summer drought made everything more difficult. Samuel had been on the porch that time and had stood up when Dawson began to shift his tone, not threatening exactly, but present in a way that was its own kind of statement. Dawson looked at him, looked at Edna, and left without saying what he had apparently been preparing to say. She felt the charge in the air after his horse disappeared down the road, the particular electric quality of a confrontation that had stopped just short of itself. "Thank you," she said to Samuel. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You were there," she said simply, and he looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes and then turned and went back inside the barn, and she stood on the porch and pressed her palm flat against the porch railing and felt the rough warm wood under her hand and the afternoon sun on her back and something large and specific moving through her chest like a river finding a new course. It was June when the thing between them shifted properly, though there had been 100 small shifts leading up to it like a slow accumulation of weight before something gives. She had been struggling with a section of the accounts that related to a cattle purchase her father had made the previous year, and that she could not reconcile with a receipt she had found in a box of his papers. She had been working at the kitchen table for 2 hours after supper, the lamp close and the numbers refusing to resolve themselves, and she had finally put her pen down and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes in a gesture of pure frustration. When she looked up, Samuel was in the doorway, having apparently come in to refill his coffee cup, and he was watching her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for once, plain concern without any of the professional neutrality he wore during working hours. "What's the trouble?" he asked. She explained the discrepancy. He put his coffee down and came to look at the ledger over her shoulder, close enough that she was acutely aware of him, the warmth of him and the smell of him, soap and leather, and the particular outdoors smell that was simply who he was, and she held very still while he studied the numbers and then reached past her to turn the pages back to an earlier entry and pointed to a line she had passed over 3 times without reading carefully. "There," he said. Your father split the payment across 2 entries because he used 2 different accounts, his operating account and a smaller savings account he kept for capital purchases. The second payment is under August instead of July because the check cleared late. She looked at where his finger pointed and saw immediately that he was right. The discrepancy resolved in an instant, the accounts balanced. I went through that page twice, she said. It's easy to miss, he said. I made the same mistake myself the first time I went over his books. He had not moved back, was still standing very close, and when she turned her head to look at him to say thank you, he was closer than she had quite calculated, close enough that the words did not come immediately. They looked at each other in the lamplight with the summer night sounds coming through the open window, cicadas and the distant lowing of cattle and the soft sound of the wind in the grass, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, something stripped of its usual careful composure, something open and uncertain and wanting in equal measure. "Edna," he said, and stopped. "Samuel," she said, and she said his name the way you say something you have been holding in your mouth for a long time, tasting it and letting it go at once. He straightened up and took a step back, and she could see him gathering himself, the professional distance coming back over him like a garment he was deliberately putting on. "I apologize," he said. "That was—" "Don't," she said quietly. She turned in her chair to face him fully. "Don't apologize for that." He stood there, hat in hand in the figurative sense since his hat was on the peg by the door, and he looked at her steadily, and the composure he had reached for was not quite sufficient to cover what was beneath it. "You're my employer," he said carefully. "Yes," she said. "It wouldn't be appropriate for me to— Samuel." She said his name again and stood up, which brought her to her full height, which was not particularly tall but was present, and she met his eyes directly in the way she met everything, head on. "I am not the sort of woman who is confused about what she feels or too timid to acknowledge it. I know what this is. If you don't feel it, then say so, and we will never speak of it again, and I will respect that entirely. But don't tell me it isn't appropriate when what you mean is something different." He was quiet for a long moment. A moth moved around the lamp between them. "I have felt it," he said, "since about the 4th day you were here. When I watched you walk that south fence line and ask better questions about the drainage situation than most men twice your experience would have thought to ask." She felt something warm and enormous settle in her chest. "All right then," she said. "All right then," he echoed, and the ghost of that careful almost smile was at the corners of his eyes. They were careful with it at first, in the way that people are careful with things they do not want to break. He was still the foreman and she was still the owner, and there were hired hands sleeping in the bunkhouse behind the barn who did not need complications in their working lives. And so they were circumspect and deliberate, and the restraint of it was in some ways its own kind of pleasure. He would find small ways to be near her that had nothing to do with the work, sitting on the same side of the porch instead of across from it, handing her things with a care that was too intentional to be accidental. She found herself lingering over the morning coffee when he was there, asking him questions about things she partly knew the answers to already just to hear him explain, for the pleasure of his voice and his considered way of putting things. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday evening in late June, which was the day she had declared a rest day from the physical work of the ranch, and they had ridden out together to the far east end of the property, where a line of pecan trees grew along the creek, and the shade was deep, and the water ran clear over smooth stones. They had brought a lunch in a saddle bag, the kind of simple practical thing, bread and hard cheese and dried peaches, and they had eaten sitting on the creek bank with their boots off and their feet in the cool water, while the horses grazed behind them. She had been telling him about something Clara had written in her last letter, something funny about the dressmaking shop and a customer who had ordered a very particular shade of green that she was convinced did not exist in nature, and she had turned to look at him mid-sentence because he had been quiet for a moment, and she found him watching her with an expression of such uncomplicated affection that the sentence simply stopped in her throat. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with 2 fingers, a gesture so careful and specific and full of intention that it was its own kind of declaration. And then he leaned forward and kissed her gently, the kiss of a man who was not in a hurry and was not performing anything, just being entirely present in the fact of it. She kissed him back, and the creek ran over the stones, and the horses moved in the grass behind them, and the Texas sun moved warm across both of them. And when they broke apart and looked at each other, she felt quite simply that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I think," he said, his voice a little different from usual, quieter and more unguarded, "that I have been waiting a long time for something I couldn't name." "And now you can name it?" she asked. He looked at her with those dark, honest eyes and the beginning of a real full smile that she had not seen the complete version of before. "Yes," he said, "I believe I can." The summer was the best she had ever had, and she had had good summers before, but none with this quality of rightness to them, this sense of everything being in the place where it belonged. The ranch work was hard and physical and satisfying, in a way that sitting at a sewing table had never quite been, the kind of tired at the end of a day that came from the whole body being fully used. She was learning faster than she had expected, building competence in small pieces, and the confidence that came with it was a different kind than she had had in Cincinnati, less defended and more rooted. She and Samuel moved through their days with the ease of people who had found their rhythm together, working side by side from dawn to dusk, and sitting together in the evenings on the porch or at the kitchen table, talking or reading or sitting in the comfortable silence that was its own form of intimacy. Hector and Pete noticed the change between them without comment, with the sensitivity of working people who understand the value of not involving themselves in their employer's personal affairs, though Edna caught Hector smiling to himself on more than one occasion and chose not to address it. In August there was a week of brutal heat that had the cattle restless and the well working harder than usual and everyone on the property short-tempered by 3 in the afternoon. On the worst day of it, Thursday of that week, when the temperature was enough to make the air above the red dirt shimmer visibly, Edna walked around the end of the barn to find Samuel talking with a man she did not know, a lean man on a bay horse with a county assessor's badge pinned to his shirt. She stopped and listened. The assessor was informing Samuel that the county had received a petition from a neighboring landowner requesting a resurvey of the Reed property's western boundary, claiming that the fence line as currently established encroached on land that was not legally part of the Reed title. The neighboring landowner's name was Clem Dawson. Samuel's expression was absolutely controlled, giving nothing away. "The owner of the Reed property is Miss Edna Reed," he said to the assessor. "You'll want to speak with her directly." Edna stepped around the corner of the barn and introduced herself, and the assessor repeated the information to her. She listened without interruption, then asked him for the specific parcel numbers in question and told him she would review her title documents and be in touch with the county office within the week. She shook his hand, watched him ride away, and then turned to Samuel. "Dawson," she said. "Dawson," he confirmed. She went to Dry Creek the following morning and spent 3 hours in George Hartley's office going over every piece of paper related to her father's original land purchase and the subsequent survey. Hartley, who had become something of an ally over the months, confirmed that her father's title was properly recorded and that the western fence line was placed correctly according to the original survey from 1878. He also told her, with the careful language of a man who chose his words precisely, that Clem Dawson had done this sort of thing before, had made a similar boundary challenge against a small farmer to the north of his property 2 years prior, and that the challenge had eventually been withdrawn, but not before it had cost the farmer enough in legal fees and anxiety to make the man sell and move on. "He's trying to exhaust me," Edna said flatly. "That would be my assessment," Hartley said. "He will find that I do not exhaust easily," she said. She filed a formal counter-response with the county office, documented with every piece of supporting evidence Hartley had helped her compile. She also wrote a letter to Dawson directly, without rancor but with absolute precision, informing him that she was aware of the legal history of his boundary challenges, and that she had the resources, both documentary and financial, to contest any false claim he chose to make against her title for as long as he chose to make them. She told him she bore him no ill will but that she intended to be a landowner in Coltrane County for a long time, and it would be in everyone's interest for them to be good neighbors rather than contentious ones. Dawson did not respond to the letter directly. The boundary challenge was quietly withdrawn from the county office records 3 weeks later. She did not hear from him again. She told Samuel about it on the evening after she got word of the withdrawal. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father would have handled that the same way you did. He'd have been louder about it, but the substance would have been the same." She accepted this as the compliment she was fairly certain he meant it to be. September brought a change in the air, the first suggestion of the long, warm Texas autumn, and with it came a conversation she had been building toward for weeks. She had been thinking about the structure of the operation, about what she wanted the ranch to become over the following years, about whether the current arrangement between herself and Samuel was the one that made the most sense going forward. And thinking about all of that had inevitably led her to thinking about what kind of life she wanted to build here, and with whom. She raised the subject directly one evening, the way she raised most subjects. "I've been thinking about the future of the property," she said. They were on the porch, the sky going from orange to purple to deep blue ahead of them, the first stars appearing. "So have I," he said. "The operation as it stands is viable," she said. "The cattle numbers are good. With reasonable management we could expand to perhaps 70 or 80 head by next spring. There's enough grass if we manage the rotation carefully. I've been thinking about a hay field on the north end," he said. "Reduce dependence on open grazing in the dry summers." "That's a good idea," she said. "It would require investment." "The accounts can support it," he said. They talked about the practical things for a while, the way they had talked about practical things for months, but there was a quality to this particular conversation that was different, a deliberateness to it, as though they were both speaking about the future in a language that meant more than the words. She set down her coffee cup and turned to look at him fully. "Samuel," she said, "what do you want? Not for the ranch, for yourself. What do you want?" He turned to look at her, and in the last light of the evening his expression was completely open in a way she had seen increasingly over the summer, the careful professional reserve worn away by months of closeness, until what was underneath was simply him, honest and direct and surprisingly tender in a way she did not think he showed to many people. "I want what I have," he said. "This land, this place, you." She felt the words settle over her like the warmest kind of certainty. "Then I have a proposal," she said. "Do you?" he said. "Not a business proposal," she clarified. He was very still for a moment. "Edna," he said, and his voice had that particular quality it had when he said her name and meant everything by it. "I am not a woman who waits for things to come to her when she can go to them," she said. "And I have known for most of this summer that you are the person I want to build this life with, not just the ranch, all of it." He stood up from his chair and crossed the short space between them and took her hand in both of his. Large, rough hands that she had watched work this land for months, hands she trusted completely, and he held it with a care that was the truest expression of who he was. "I would count it the greatest honor of my life," he said quietly, "if you would agree to be my wife." She stood up and he was close, very close, and she put her other hand against his face, against the jaw that was always a day or two from needing a shave, and felt him lean into it the way a person leans into something they have been wanting without knowing they were allowed to want it. "I believe that was my proposal," she said. "Then my answer is yes," he said, "with everything I have." He kissed her there on the porch with the stars coming out above them and the cattle quiet in the pastures and the whole enormous Texas night spreading out in every direction. and she kissed him back with the feeling of someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey and knows, without any doubt, that they are not leaving. They were married in October of 1882 in the small church at the end of Dry Creek's Main Street, on a Saturday morning when the air was just beginning to carry the genuine chill of autumn, and the sky was the deep, brilliant blue of the Texas fall. The ceremony was simple, as both of them preferred. Harold Finch from the post office came, and George Hartley and his wife, and Hector and Pete, and a handful of other people from the county who had come to know Edna in the months since her arrival. She wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, the first piece of serious dressmaking she had done since leaving Cincinnati, dark blue wool with a fitted bodice and simple clean lines, and she looked exactly like herself in it, precise and self-possessed and quietly lovely. Samuel stood at the front of the church in a suit he had clearly bought new for the occasion, and the expression on his face when she walked through the door was one she knew she would remember for the rest of her life: uncomplicated joy. The face of a man who had not expected to have exactly what he wanted, and was finding the reality of it almost more than he knew what to do with. The minister asked them if they would take each other, and they said yes, and the whole church felt it as a true thing, not a ceremony exactly, but a confirmation of something already accomplished. There was a small gathering at the ranch afterward, the kind of gathering where people brought food and ate on the porch and in the kitchen, and in the yard because there were too many people to fit in the house, and the afternoon was warm enough and long enough that no one was in any hurry to leave. Hector had procured several bottles of a reasonably good wine from somewhere he declined to specify, and Pete played the fiddle with an enthusiasm that more than compensated for what it occasionally lacked in precision, and Harold Finch turned out to have a gift for a particular kind of dry storytelling that had everyone laughing until the sun went down. After everyone had gone and the kitchen was more or less tidied and the house was quiet, Edna stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark land under the stars, and Samuel came and stood beside her, and she leaned into him the way she had been leaning into the land itself all summer, with the ease of something that fits. "Happy?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply, because it was simply true. They worked the ranch together through the winter of 1882 and into the spring of 1883, and the hay field project on the north end began to take shape, and the cattle herd grew to 68 head by April, and the operation had a solidity to it that it had been building toward for 2 years. Hector brought his wife and his 2 youngest children out from San Antonio in the spring, having apparently decided that the Reed Ranch was stable enough to be worth relocating his family to, and they moved into the foreman's quarters that Samuel had vacated, which Edna had expanded into a proper small house over the winter with lumber from the mill in Dry Creek. Having Maria Hector on the property changed the texture of daily life in ways Edna had not anticipated and thoroughly appreciated. Maria was practical and warm and knew things about cattle and land and medicine, and cooking that Edna learned from with the same focused attention she had brought to everything else since arriving in Texas. The news came in May of 1883, the kind of news that changes everything. Edna told Samuel in the kitchen one morning before the hired hands were up, while the coffee was still heating, quietly and directly, which was the only way she knew to say important things. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who is receiving information too significant to process at full speed, and then he crossed to her in 2 strides and held her carefully, his face in her hair, his arms around her with a gentleness that was its own form of eloquence. "All right," he said, against her hair. "All right," she agreed, into his shoulder. She worked through the summer with modifications rather than cessation, because she was not a woman who withdrew from her life, but she was also not a woman who ignored the requirements of her situation, and she and Samuel navigated the adjustment together with the practical thoughtfulness that characterized everything they did. He was solicitous in ways that were not fussy, checking on her without hovering, taking on extra physical labor without making her feel managed, being present in the evenings with a quality of attention that was different from what it had been before, fuller somehow, more anchored. In the evenings they sat on the porch in the cooling air and talked about names and plans and the particular terror and wonder of being responsible for someone entirely new to the world, someone who would grow up on this land and know it the way Edna was still learning to know it, from the beginning, from the ground up. "Boy or girl," she said one evening, "what do you hope?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about things. "I don't have a preference," he said. "I just hope for health." "That's the right answer," she said, "but I know you have a preference." He laughed, that warm, genuine laugh she had loved from the first time she heard it. "I might have a slight inclination," he admitted, "toward a boy, the first one, to have someone to teach this land to." "You can teach a girl this land," she pointed out. "You're right," he said immediately, without qualification, "and I will regardless." "But you want a boy first," she said. "A little bit," he admitted. "Then we'll see," she said. And she tucked her hand into his arm and they sat in the warm September evening with the land around them, and the particular silence of a life that had found its shape. The baby arrived in November, and it was a boy, which Samuel learned in the manner of all fathers of the era, waiting outside the bedroom door, while Maria and the doctor from Dry Creek did the actual work, standing with his hat in his hands and his usual composure entirely absent, pacing the porch until Edna's voice called for him, and he came in to find his wife exhausted and luminous and their son, small and red-faced and emphatic in his opinion of the world, held in the crook of her arm. They named him Thomas Samuel Redmond, Thomas for her father and Samuel for his, and the name felt right in the way that things feel right when they honor everything that came before without being trapped by it. Samuel held his son that first time with a carefulness so extreme it was almost comic, but the expression on his face was something Edna committed to memory with the precision she gave to everything that mattered, something so unguarded and purely feeling that it made her throat tighten. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, as though volume might break something. "I have been expecting you." The baby blinked at him with the ancient unfocused eyes of the newborn, and made a small sound of either protest or interest. "He's not impressed," Edna said. "He will be," Samuel said, "eventually." The winter of 1883 into 1884 was the season that properly established the Redmond Ranch, as people in Dry Creek had begun to call it, with the kind of dual naming that was the county's informal way of acknowledging the equal partnership of its running. The hay field had produced well enough to provide supplemental feed through the cold months, which meant the cattle held their condition better than most operations in the county through the February freeze that came hard and fast and caught several neighboring ranches with insufficient winter preparation. Samuel had been watching the sky and the behavior of the cattle for a week before the freeze arrived, and had moved the herd to the south pasture near the house, and ensured they had shelter from the north wind, and the operation came through with all 68 head intact and in good condition. This fact was noted by their neighbors, and the reputation of the ranch shifted in those months from the property of the uncertain Eastern woman to something more solid, a well-run operation managed by people who knew what they were doing. Harold Finch told her in the spring that he had heard from 2 different people in 1 week that Samuel Redmond was among the best ranch managers in the county, and that the Reed land had never looked better than it did now. Young Pete, who had turned 20 the previous fall and had been on the property for 2 years, asked Samuel one spring morning for advice about starting his own operation, having saved enough from his wages for a modest land purchase. Samuel spent an entire evening talking him through it with the thoroughness that was his particular gift, going over what Pete knew and did not know, what he would need to learn, how to evaluate a property, what the first 2 years would look like. When Pete left the kitchen that night, he looked like a man who had been given a road map, and Edna watched Samuel from across the table with the warm, particular pride of someone who loves a person and sees them being fully who they are. Pete left the ranch in late April of 1884, heading south with his savings and his new knowledge, and a handshake from Samuel, and a jar of preserved peaches from Edna. And they hired a young man named Cal in his place, a quiet, hard-working 18-year-old who had grown up on a neighboring ranch and knew cattle already, and simply needed steady work. Thomas was 6 months old by the time the spring work began in earnest, and he spent his days in a basket in whatever room or corner of the yard his parents happened to be working in, observing the world with the serious attention of an infant who is taking extensive notes. Maria took him some mornings, having a particular talent with babies that was apparently unrelated to her own children being substantially older. And those mornings, Edna worked with the pure concentration of someone who has temporarily recovered the version of themselves that existed before they were responsible for another person's entire existence, which she found she both needed and was only partly comfortable with. In the summer of 1884, Edna wrote to her friend Clara in Cincinnati, a long letter, much longer than her usual ones, describing the ranch and the work in Samuel and Thomas, and the particular quality of the Texas light in July, and the sound of the cattle at dawn, and the way the stars looked from the porch on a clear night. She wrote it over 3 evenings, and it came to 12 pages, which was more than she had written to anyone in a long time, and when she sealed it, she felt as though she had given Clara the actual thing rather than a report on it. Clara wrote back 3 months later, as Clara always did, with a mix of genuine warmth and the amused affection of a woman who had watched her friend leave for the frontier, and find there exactly the life that the city had never been quite large enough to hold. She said that the dressmaker's shop had a new girl who was very good at hemming but terrible at cutting, and that the building where Edna's old apartment had been was being torn down to make way for a wider street, and that Cincinnati was fine and busy and exactly the same as ever. She said she was very happy for Edna, said it in the plain, direct way that meant she meant it completely, and Edna folded the letter and kept it in the cedar box where she kept things that mattered. On Thomas's first birthday in November of 1884, they made a cake, which was a production requiring Maria's knowledge and Edna's patience in approximately equal measure, and they put Thomas in front of it and let him destroy it with the methodical enthusiasm of a 1-year-old discovering that hands make excellent tools. Samuel sat beside his son and laughed in the way he only laughed at Thomas, a different quality of laugh from his usual, something younger in it, and Edna looked at the two of them, man and baby, the one dark and weathered and the other round and new and so entirely unformed, and felt the kind of happiness that has substance to it, that sits in the body like ballast and keeps you from drifting. The following year brought the expansion they had planned. The hay field was doubled, and Samuel hired a second full-time hand in addition to Cal, a man named Davis who came with 15 years of Texas cattle experience, and who proved in the first 3 weeks to be worth exactly what they were paying him and then some. The cattle herd reached 80 head by fall, and the barn got its new roof section at last, and Samuel built a second bedroom onto the house in anticipation of the news Edna had given him in August. "Again," he said when she told him. "Again," she confirmed. "All right," he said for the second time and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and Thomas watched this exchange from the floor where he was systematically attempting to remove the leg from a wooden chair with the pure single-minded determination that was apparently his defining characteristic so far. The second child came in the spring of 1886, and this time it was a girl. They named her May, which was her birth month and which had the clean simplicity of the best names. She was a different kind of baby from Thomas, quieter and more observant, with her mother's gray eyes and her father's particular composure, and she looked at the world from the beginning with an expression of careful assessment that Edna recognized with a pang of amused recognition as something she apparently passed along. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had developed opinions about most things, regarded his sister for a long moment in her basket the first morning she came home, and then announced that she was small, and that he would teach her things when she got bigger. Samuel caught Edna's eye over Thomas's head, and they exchanged the specific private look of parents who are genuinely delighted by their children and are trying not to let the delight become noise. By the summer of 1886, the Redmond Ranch was among the better established operations in Coltrane County, not the largest but one of the most consistently well managed, with a reputation for sound cattle and fair dealing that had been built up year by year through simple competence and the refusal to cut corners. They had weathered a dry summer in 1885 better than most of their neighbors because of the hay stores, and had sold surplus hay to 2 neighboring operations at a fair price, which had done as much for their standing in the county as anything else. Clem Dawson had sold his western acreage to a cattle company out of Fort Worth in the spring of 1885 and had removed himself from the county entirely, a development that Edna heard about from Harold Finch with a satisfaction she was dignified enough to keep largely internal. The land that had bordered the Reed property on the west was now owned by the Fort Worth Company, who were interested only in the economics of the thing and had no quarrel with their neighbors, and the boundary that Dawson had once tried to challenge was never raised again. The church in Dry Creek put up a new building in 1885, and the town added a proper doctor's office when the circuit doctor from San Antonio agreed to establish a permanent practice, and a schoolhouse was raised on the north end of the main street in the fall of 1886, all of which Edna observed with the interest of someone whose children would eventually use all of these things. She attended the town meetings that concerned the school, as did several other women in the county, and she noticed that the school board, which was composed entirely of men, listened to her rather more carefully than they might have listened to a woman who had arrived 4 years earlier with a leather trunk and a one-way ticket, and an expression that suggested she was prepared to argue about anything that required arguing about. She mentioned this to Samuel one evening, the fact of being listened to, and he looked at her with the expression that meant he found her both amusing and admirable. "You have not made it easy for anyone to dismiss you," he said. "Good," she said. "It was never going to be easy," he said, with the seriousness beneath the surface of the observation that she heard clearly. It was true, and they both knew it. She was a woman who owned land and ran it successfully, which was unusual enough to attract a particular kind of attention, the kind that was sometimes respect and sometimes resentment, and was occasionally both at once. She had navigated it by being so consistently competent and straightforward that it became difficult to maintain an objection to her on principle. Samuel had understood this from the beginning and had supported it without making it complicated, which was the specific thing she valued about him most, that his support was clean, without conditions or qualifications, simply there. Thomas started at the school in the fall of 1887, at age 3, which was a year younger than most children, but which the teacher, a young woman named Miss Alvarez who had come from San Antonio, and who was the most qualified person in the room by a considerable margin, judged appropriate given his clear capacity for information. He came home the first day with chalk dust on his hands, and a report about the other children that was detailed to the point of being genuinely comprehensive. Samuel listened to this report with the expression of a man who is struggling to maintain a serious face and failing slightly, and Edna listened and asked questions, and Thomas answered each question with the patience of someone who does not mind being thorough. In the winter of 1887, Edna received another letter from Cincinnati. It was not from Clara this time, but from the attorney who had handled the estate of the woman who had owned the dressmaking shop, who had died in October. She had left the shop to Edna, in a bequest that came with a note in the old woman's handwriting that said she had watched Edna work for 5 years and had never once seen her do anything halfway. There was no property to inherit, the building was rented, but there were the equipment and the remaining inventory, and there was a modest cash sum from the estate. She thought about what to do with this for several weeks before she spoke to Samuel about it. When she did, sitting at the kitchen table on a February evening with the cold pressing against the windows and the lamp between them and Thomas asleep in his room and May in her cradle near the stove, she told him the full situation. He listened carefully, as he always did. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked, which was always his first question with her decisions, never telling her what he thought she ought to do before he had asked what she wanted. "I think the money should go into the ranch," she said. "The equipment can be sold or donated. There's no practical use for a dressmaking shop in Dry Creek, but the money is enough to make a real difference to the cattle expansion." She paused. "And I think I want to use a small part of it to start a lending library in Dry Creek, a room in the back of the post office, or something similar. Harold has mentioned several times that there's almost no way for people in this county to access books, and I know how much it matters." He was quiet for a moment. "A library," he said. "A small one," she said. "I'd donate my own books to start with, and I'd write to publishers in New York and Cincinnati about donations. It doesn't require much space, just the will to do it." He looked at her across the lamp, and the expression on his face was the full, unguarded version of what she had always known was there, the complete depth of what he felt for her, clear and steady, and without any reservation. "I think," he said quietly, "that your father would have found it very satisfying to see what you've made of things here." She felt the familiar pressure in her chest at the mention of her father, still tender 4 years later, still present, but different now, no longer raw with guilt and distance. More like love with nowhere to go, finding new places. "I think he would have found you satisfying," she said, and meant it entirely. "I think he would have liked you very much." Samuel smiled, and it was the full, warm smile that she still found, after 4 years, slightly disorienting in its effect on her, the smile of a man in full possession of his own happiness. "The library is a good idea," he said. "I'll help you write the letters." The library opened in the spring of 1888, in 2 shelves in the back room of Harold Finch's post office, with 47 books and a hand-painted sign above the door that read Redmond Lending Library in letters that Edna had painted herself with a deliberate, careful hand. Harold took on the management of it with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting for someone to give him exactly this responsibility. And by the end of the first year, it had 63 books and regular borrowers who drove in from ranches 10 miles away. Thomas was 4 and May was 2 the summer the library opened. And on the Saturday it opened, Edna brought them both to the post office and let Thomas examine every book on the shelves while May sat on Samuel's shoulders and watched with her usual composed attention. Thomas chose a book about birds with detailed illustrations, which he then carried home and placed on the table by his bed, with a reverence that made both his parents very quiet in the way of people confronted with something too genuine to respond to with anything other than silence. The summer of 1888 was a good one, warm and adequately watered, and the cattle herd reached 90 head without strain on the grazing. Davis had proven himself a foreman in his own right and had taken on more responsibility over the previous year, which freed Samuel to think about the next phase of the operation, which he had been discussing with Edna in pieces over many evenings. He wanted to invest in a small breeding program, selecting for hardier cattle better adapted to the Texas climate rather than simply buying and selling on market terms. It required more capital and more patience than simple cattle ranching, but the potential return over a decade was substantially better, and both of them had the patience for long-term thinking. They discussed it the way they discussed everything, thoroughly and without hurry, and she asked the questions she could not yet answer herself, and he explained without condescension, and she pushed back when she had a different perspective, and he listened and sometimes conceded, and sometimes held his position with the evidence to support it, and the conversation moved forward the way all their conversations moved forward, toward a decision that was genuinely shared. The breeding program began in the fall of 1888 with the purchase of 3 quality bulls at a sale in San Antonio, which Samuel made with Cal while Edna managed the ranch. And when they returned with the animals, there was something proprietorial in the way Samuel walked the new bulls into the south pasture that made her smile. The satisfaction of a man doing something he has thought carefully about and believed in completely. By the time Thomas was 5 and May was 3, the ranch had the quality of something built to last, not rigid but rooted, with enough strength in its foundations to flex without breaking. Edna had learned to read weather by the behavior of the animals and the color of the horizon, had learned to identify the signs of illness in cattle before they became critical, had learned the particular seasonal rhythms of the land, when the grass would be richest and when it would be sparse, which gullies filled first after rain, and which dried last in summer. She knew the land the way her father had always hoped she would know it, from the inside, from the years of showing up every morning. She walked the south fence one afternoon in October of 1889 with May on her hip, May being an enthusiastic walker in short distances and a fervent advocate for being carried in longer ones. And she stopped at the southeast corner, where the live oak tree grew close to the fence line, and its roots had lifted one post so many times over the years that Samuel had finally put in a deep concrete base for it. She stood at the fence and looked south across the open land toward the wide, flat horizon, the same view her father had looked at for years before his health failed, and she thought about the chain of things, his decision to come here, his illness, his dying with the faith that she would come, Samuel's 3 years of showing up every morning on land that was not his and keeping it whole, her own arrival with a leather trunk and a grief she had not fully acknowledged, the way all of it had accumulated into this. This fence line, this child on her hip, this sky, this life. May patted her cheek with a small, firm hand. "Mama," she said, in the tone of someone recalling a distracted person to the present. "Here," Edna said. "I'm here." She walked back to the ranch house in the warm October afternoon, and from the barn she could hear Samuel's voice, low and even, explaining something to Cal about the new fencing project on the east boundary, and the sound of it was as familiar and necessary as the sound of the creek or the wind in the grass, something that had become part of the particular music of her days. He came in at sundown, dusty from the day's work, and washed at the pump and came into the kitchen where she had supper on the stove, and Thomas was at the table with his bird book, and his new school reader open side by side, studying both simultaneously with the focused ambition of a 5-year-old who had decided that learning could not wait. May was already asleep in her room, having made her position on the length of days quite clear around 5 o'clock. He sat down at the table and looked at Thomas's dual reading project for a moment and then at her over the boy's head, and the look between them carried everything, the day's work and the children and the 7 years of this life and the particular satisfaction of being exactly where you had decided to be. "How was the fence?" she asked. "Solid," he said. "Cal's getting good." "He is," she agreed. Thomas looked up from his books. "Papa, what do you call it when a bird flies in a circle like this?" He made a spiraling motion with his finger. "Soaring," Samuel said. Thomas considered this and wrote it in the margin of the reader with his pencil, a violation of proper book use that his mother had given up attempting to address because there was something too earnest about it to correct convincingly. "Thomas," Samuel said, "did you finish the fence post counting I asked you to help with this morning?" 47 on the south side, Thomas said, "and 32 on the east, but the east has 3 that need replacing and I put a stick by each one." Samuel looked at his son with an expression that was purely proud, the honest, uncomplicated pride of a father who sees in his child something genuinely good. "Well done," he said. Thomas returned to his books with the satisfaction of a person who has done their work and been told so. Edna put 2 plates on the table and sat down, and the 3 of them ate supper in the warm kitchen with the lamp between them and the autumn evening pressing gentle against the windows. And outside the 89 head of cattle stood in the night pasture, and the new fence stretched clean and straight around the eastern boundary. and the hay stacked in the barn was enough for 2 winters, and the library in Dry Creek had 112 books now. And somewhere in the east pasture, the 3 new breeding bulls were settling into the rhythms of the land. Later, much later, after Thomas was in bed and the kitchen was quiet, she sat on the porch in the cool night with Samuel beside her, their shoulders touching, looking at the stars that spread from one flat horizon to the other in their incomprehensible abundance. "Samuel," she said. "Edna," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And the night was warm enough still and quiet enough that the only sounds were the distant cattle and the wind in the grass, and the creak of the porch boards, and the sound of 2 people breathing together in the particular harmony of those who have built something real and know it. She thought about the letter that had come to her Cincinnati apartment 7 years before, the brief dry legal language of it, and the 3-day train journey, and the long coach ride into red dust and wide sky, and the first sight of the ranch with its solid fence lines and its tended garden, and a man at the fence post with his back to her, and how she had called out and he had turned around. She thought about her father who had known she would come, who had left her something worth coming to, who had already found the one person who would keep it safe until she arrived. "I think," she said quietly into the enormous Texas night, "that everything happened the way it was supposed to." Samuel was quiet for a moment, his arms solid around her, his breathing even and steady. "I think so too," he said. And they sat there on the porch of the land that Thomas Reed had built, and Samuel Redmond had kept, and Edna Reed had come to claim and made instead into a life, while the stars moved in their long, slow arc, and the land lay quiet and whole around them, and the future stretched out ahead in all its large and ordinary promise, full of work and seasons and children growing and cattle moving, and the particular small daily miracle of 2 people choosing each other again, every morning. For the rest of everything, the years went on, as years do, each one adding something new to the accumulation of what they had built. Thomas grew into a serious, capable boy who had his father's patience and his mother's directness in exactly the balance required to make him formidable by the age of 10. And May grew into a girl who observed everything, and said what she meant, and had her mother's gray eyes and her father's quiet steadiness. And between them, they were raising 2 people who belonged entirely to the land they had been born on. In the spring of 1891, Edna discovered she was expecting again, their 3rd child, and she told Samuel in the kitchen in the early morning as she had always told him the important things, quietly and plainly. And he held her in the kitchen in the thin spring light with the coffee going, and the birds starting outside the window, and his arms around her in the way that had always felt like the specific physical meaning of being home. The 3rd child arrived in December of 1891, another boy, whom they named Frank, after no one in particular but because they both felt the name was his from the moment they looked at him. And he arrived into a household that was ready for him in every sense, a house full of books and work, and the smell of good cooking, and the sounds of cattle, and the kind of love that does not make noise about itself, because it has nowhere else to be. On Christmas morning of 1891, with Frank 3 weeks old and May 5 and Thomas 7, Samuel built a fire in the front room which they did not often use, the good room with the 2 chairs and the small table they had bought in San Antonio 3 years earlier, and they sat together as a family in the firelight with the cold, clear day visible through the window, the red dirt and the winter-pale grass, and the sky that was still that particular enormous blue, and Edna looked at all of it. The children and the fire and the man beside her, who had been a stranger on a fence line 9 years before, and felt the satisfying completeness of a life that had found its proper shape and filled it fully. She thought of her father then, as she often did in quiet moments, thought of him walking this land in the years before she knew him as a man and not just a father, thought of him choosing this place with the same stubbornness that had driven her here too. She hoped he could see it. She thought he could. Samuel looked over at her, and read something in her expression the way he had always been able to read her, with the ease of long practice and genuine attention. "Thomas," he said softly, meaning her father, not their son. "Yes," she said. He took her hand and held it, and the fire crackled, and Frank made a small sound from his basket, and May leaned against her mother's knee looking at the fire with those serious gray eyes, and Thomas was already halfway to the window to look at something in the yard that had caught his attention, irrepressible and earnest and entirely himself. Outside, the land lay steady and wide under the winter sky, every acre of it known and tended and loved, the fence line straight, and the cattle settled, and the hay in the barn and the creek running clear. And the Redmond ranch stood in the Texas afternoon as solid and purposeful as anything that has been built right, built by people who showed up every morning and did the work and meant every bit of it. This was what Thomas Reed had held in his mind in his final weeks, Edna believed, not the land itself but the life the land could hold. He had been right about the stubbornness being a virtue. He had been right about the man who would keep it safe until she arrived. He had been right about all of it, and she was here to prove it, with her husband's hand in hers and her children around her, and the enormous Texas sky pressing down on every acre she owned, every acre she had earned, every acre she intended to pass on whole and good and full of the future, the way all good land gets passed on when the people who hold it love it properly. She pressed Samuel's hand once, and he pressed back, and outside the winter light moved slow across the red dirt and the green gold grass and the wide and permanent land, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.